going to be reading poems that came to me about American soldiers and Vietnamese and events that I participated in during the Vietnam War in 1969. I was a draftee and a member of the Kansas National Guard. I served with the 4th and 9th Infantry along the Cambodian border, and then in the General's office at Headquarters Company at 25th Division Headquarters. Until recently, Vietnam veterans have been treated downright shabbily. In fact, at one time, many of the soldiers were stereotyped as being low-lifes or warmongers, one of the two. The irony in that is that recently it's been estimated that there's over 10 million American men who claim to have been in the Vietnam War who actually were not. There were about 2.5 million Americans who served in Vietnam in combat capacity, about between 1 and 1.6 million that were actually in combat or combat situations. There were also a lot of nurses and Salvation Army personnel and USO volunteers, but I really didn't have any contact with any of them because I was mainly out in the field. And of course, in the case of Vietnam veterans, there are many who still serve. Vietnam veterans have a very high suicide rate. The first poem I'm going to read is a litany of the soldiers of all stripes that I came into contact with when I was in Vietnam. It's called Warriors. Farm boys who could fix anything, shoot whatever moved. Apaches who could track Charlie anywhere. Filipinos born in the jungle who already knew about machetes and garrotes. Puerto Ricans, headbands inked with Viva Puerto Rico Libre, who could carry M16s but couldn't vote. Felons wanting out of jail to kill for pay and cheap boom boom. Lifer sergeants in air-conditioned bunkers with stolen generators for sale. Aussies itching to hunt more gooks. Mercenaries after big bonuses. National Guardsmen holding down the draft. Clerks keeping records for generals eager to write military history. Ghetto whites and ghetto blacks scrawny enough to coil through booby-trapped tunnels. 18-year-olds marching in uneven cadence to John Philip Sousa, promised jobs they would never work, waking years later with bombshell bellies, blue tracers streaking towards them into nightmare bunkers just before dawn. This next poem is an introductory poem to the others. It's called Through a Helicopter Door. Turn back if you haven't the stomach. It's not like the war on television. Oils smeared on the air. Rotors kick you in the teeth with dust and rock. The next thing you know, you're on the ground screaming for people. You crawl and crawl, but the only place to hide is what you said goodbye to when you became of age. I had a friend from Kansas City who was given the choice of serving out a jail term or joining the Army and going to Vietnam. He was a street kid like I was, and he was a street fighter. He'd accumulated a very long rap sheet. So Vietnam sounded better to him than jail. And in the few letters that he wrote, it turned out that he really enjoyed what he was doing. He loved to go out on combat missions. I admired him at one time for being someone who could stand up to authority figures. And I was surprised that it seemed to me like he had changed in the process to going from a victim to a persecutor. I call this poem the myth maker. Free falling 5 feet, M16 and grenade outstretched as he descends from the gunship into the landmine's fragmented soul. He becomes mythical, a hero to be eulogized by those he hates. I remember him in 1963 getting cold-cocked by a string bean man at the bar of the Torch Club off 31st and Main, victim of his problematical mouth. Despite that, and the incident when he yanked a ball cap down Coach Moore's porcine face, they say he exited the chopper screaming. Some of the symptoms of PTSD are hypervigilance, being easily startled and jumpy all the time, irritable, and having a lot of angry outbursts, having nightmares and trouble sleeping, not being able to concentrate. I had another friend who had all those symptoms and more. He was a registered nurse who was drafted into the Army and served as a medic. And during one of the missions, he was right in the middle of a mortar round, and it shattered just about every bone in his body. As a result, he lost a lot of his eyesight. He developed diabetes, and of course, he had trouble walking. John was his name. He was one of the first members of the chapter of Vietnam Veterans Against the War in our area. He lost his life tragically in an auto accident. He had been to VA to try to get more disability money for his diabetes, and he was denied. And on the way home, he turned the wrong way down a frontage road and ran smack into a large semi-truck and died on the spot. The poem is called The Medic. It's over now, John. You didn't make the history books. You've got to go back to work, pay off your mortgage. You can't smoke pot anymore to get yourself out of bed. Your kids will want more than slogans and rock songs. You'll have to do more than sit on a front porch and stare into sunsets. Nobody will care about your blood and gut stories. No one will believe what you saw, what you did, what they did, or what the Department of Defense is hiding. Your letters will go unread. You'll grow bitter and mean, like those old men at Veterans Day parades. The GI Bill's not going to pay for your anger. Crazy doesn't count. There's been a lot of talk lately, negative talk about snipers. What a lot of people don't realize is that a sniper saves a lot of lives and a lot of civilian casualties. I ran into a guy many years after the war in early 2000s at a church function. He was there standing at the entrance of the church with his sleeping bag rolled up and another bag on his shoulder. Looked terrible. He was probably in his 50s then, maybe 60s. He was an American Indian and was at the church because he needed something to eat, and he was asking for a ride to the airport. In the meantime, while he was standing there, he became very ill, and I drove him to the emergency room in Denver. This was out in Colorado. A couple of days later, he called me and said that the doctors had him in enough better shape that he could travel, and he'd gotten himself a ticket to London, where he had seen a specialist before. I went to meet him at the hospital, and he was really shaky trying to do some paperwork, so I helped him with it. And in the process, I saw his DD 214, which is a short form history of your military service. Everything he had told me was true. He had a Bronze Star, he had a Purple Heart, he had all kinds of medals for being a sharpshooter. What he did was, in Vietnam, he was there for 3 tours. He disguised himself as a Vietnamese, and he could do that. He had dark hair, dark skin, his eyes looked Asian, he was short and small. And what else he did that impressed me was he would eat the food that the Vietnamese ate, because Vietnamese could smell Americans. He could walk down the road with them and carry his dissembled rifle. His job was to hand out village chiefs who were involved with the Viet Cong and liaison with the North Vietnamese. And then one time he got caught and was shot right through his liver, spleen, and pancreas. And I could tell he was dying. He was in serious condition. But this poem then is about him, because I don't go out looking for poems. Poems come to me, and he was a poem that came directly to me out of nowhere. The poem is called Sniper. In the mornings he went hunting, perched in tree branches to target a village chief. And what does he do now, this man who went hunting? For men he learned to hunt as though they were not men, when there are no more men like them to hunt. And what meaning does it give to this man now to say, as he once said to himself, sliding around into the polished chamber, breathing the fumes of gun oil, cordite and precision, one bullet, one kill. During the first few months when I came back from Vietnam, some of my friends asked me the same 2 questions. The first was, what was it like over there anyway? And the second one was, did you ever kill anybody? I had really no words to explain what had gone on in Vietnam. It was too complicated, and there were so many things to tell them about. So I started using adjectives like grotesque, boring, surreal, insane, monstrous, a nightmare, immoral. One thing, though, that I did tell them about was a dog that I took care of for a while when I was in Tay Ninh. That was before I was transferred to Cu Chi. It was a puppy that had been run over by a Jeep and fixed by the medics and belonged to the sergeant that I reported to. He left the dog in my care when he went on R&R, so I nursed it during that time. And then I was transferred and didn't see the dog anymore until about a couple of months later, when I had a chance to go back to Tay Ninh on an afternoon off. I wanted to talk to Diaz, and I wanted to see the puppy. This poem is about my encounter with the dog I believe was the dog that I cared for, although a lot of the base camp dogs look pretty much the same. The poem is called War Dog. I shouldn't wonder why you give me that streetwise smile, all teeth and head cocked, ready to take me on. I'm not prepared for another fight. You can stand me off by yourself, a lifer like you, back against the bunker, a head taller now than the other hounds. Diaz called you puppy, but you were never a puppy, and I was never a child. You caught the rear wheel of a Jeep, and I caught this war. I've only come back to say goodbye, to look around and say, it happened. This has to be quick. I'm a short timer now, gears turned in and orders cut. They don't talk to me much. I'm one of those who will live. It's not my fault I got transferred. It's not my fault Diaz is dead. Not much is sure in a place like this, not even friends. You do what you can. The medics stitched your viscera into its sack. We stayed up all night, an hour a man, holding your leg so the cast would set. I can't squeeze back what's been torn away. But Butterball, my little puppy, I leave you one thing sure. The night I rocked and you cried, we held a moment of childhood. For any soldier, getting a letter from home or a package is really a huge event. I got packets of letters from time to time, but the packet of letters I enjoyed the most were from a little brother of mine. He was in the 4th grade, I believe. The letters were just hilarious, and I read them and reread them, carried them around with me. This poem is about that experience. It's called Mail Call. On those days his name is called, he hungers for their lost voices. Her perfumed letters ask for money and sympathy, the wife who demands more than he can give. In the dusk-confused afternoon, his mouth splits into what might be a smile, not for her letters, but theirs, his brother's 4th grade class. Here, some become addicted to opium, he to this monthly packet of 30 letters. Their drawings of fighter pilots, dotted lines from muzzle flash to target. They promise boxes of 22s, proclaim his heroism, send St. Christopher medals, a plea to be careful over there, Billy. Alone on the tarmac in a chopper's shadow, he savors the topmost letter, X'd and O'd with hugs and kisses, stashes the rest in his backpack. There he holds together with rubber bands the only goodness he still knows. I was standing one afternoon at the entrance to Coochie Base Camp with my commanding officer, watching them frisk and check in the hooch maids who worked in the camp. They scrubbed our clothes and cleaned our hooches. He was a well-educated man, well-read. He turned to me and just said casually, "You know, this was once a country of artisans and poets." And I found, as I went along, that that was the case, that the Vietnamese are extremely refined, innovative, very creative people. So he was sad that he was seeing this happen. I also learned that the Vietnamese had no banking system. They tried to get US dollars if they could, but they didn't really have any currency, so they saved gold. And there was a lot of gold in Vietnam. They put it in their teeth, and they wore it on their body, right in front of everybody. Their rings, they had a lot of gold on them. That made the goldsmith a very important person. Now the goldsmith, one of the goldsmiths in Tay Ninh, did work at the Cao Dai temple. The Cao Dais were a small sect that had 3 gods, Jesus, Victor Hugo, and Buddha. So our hooch maid was a Cao Dai named Rue, very beautiful young woman. And then she stopped coming, so we didn't know what happened to her. Maybe she went to work for her father, found a better job. Maybe she became a Viet Cong. A few months later, they brought her through, these guys, Vietnamese that worked in the camp. She was a prostitute, and she was addicted probably on opium. Her nose was running, and she was just a mess. So this poem is about her, the goldsmith's daughter. Go, Buddha, go to the Cao temple. Implore Jesus and Victor Hugo, the all-seeing eye. Tell them of the girl Rue, squatting in the fish market. I saw her there today, hair hacked short, mouth sunken and limp, dust from the road turning her gray in the sun. Her family hides in the jungle. She has sold her gold teeth, her bracelets and chains. They lead her through the base camps from one bunker to another, her nose flowing muddy like the Mekong. Now that her lover is beheaded, she gives them boom booms for opium and $5 bill. Go, Buddha, tell them Rue was our hooch maid. She brought us fresh flounder once. She swept the floorboards clean. The Army had a program for Viet Cong who wanted to surrender. It was called the Chu Hoi program. Chu Hoi means open arms. Some of them acted as scouts or intelligence, counterintelligence officers. When I was in Cu Chi working in the general's office, I got to know one of them very well. He was 39 years old, but he didn't look that old. Looked like he was in his 20s. He'd been trained in Moscow because the Russians were sending money and information to the Viet Cong. He wore granny glasses. He looked like a college student. But he was required to perform those services for the military. He just got tired of living out in the jungle and not seeing his family. And he had lost faith actually in the Viet Cong. This poem is about him. It's called the Chu Hoi. Scrape a flounder on a new piece of lumber. Crack the egg on a stone and drink it down. War has such a sweet taste when you're in the base camp and the sun is shining. For now sleep boldly in the middle of the day and dream your life the way it might have been. Give the woman a name, any name that suits you. Don't worry about dying until tomorrow. Make them sweat it out. People of somewhat an unknown casualty in the Vietnam War were the Eurasian children that were bred by the GIs with the Vietnamese women, usually the prostitutes. I saw this girl waiting in line at the gate at Cu Chi Base Camp, waiting to be accepted to come into the camp to work. The poem, I think, explains itself. It's called The Girl Named Too Tall. From my Jeep in a convoy grinding through the base camp gate, I watch her stoop her shoulders to match the height of mama-sans in bamboo hats, pucker her mouth to hide her brilliant white teeth from their beetle-nut sneers. What can I do in the middle of a war for a beautiful girl who's 6 foot even, oriental and black? She drops her eyes to the dusty road, caught in a line where guards will feel her up before she's free to scrub their clothes. Back in the 60s, opinion polls were not as prevalent as they are today, especially about politics. And of course, everyone had an opinion about the war. What used to aggravate those of us who were in Vietnam was that they really didn't know what they were talking about. And I don't mean ordinary citizens, as they're called today. I'm talking about people in Congress and commentators and news people who had never been there. People sitting in their homes who were mouthing off about the war, who were for the war but didn't know what the war was really about. In fact, I often wondered what value opinion polls have, because even today most Americans don't know what they're talking about. They don't even bother to find out. At least that's my opinion. This poem is a comment on that phenomenon of developing opinions about political matters without having the correct information, especially relevant for people who may have been in World War II or in Korea at that time, who didn't really understand about Vietnam, but just took it on the word of the government that it was a just war. It's called War Stories. Old men of the VFW, put down your mugs and listen up. I have a story too. It's about the face of a second lieutenant I keep seeing in my dreams. He staggers bareheaded onto the road out there in the rubber plantation. He's holding up a number 10 envelope with the remainders of one of your sons, bone slivers scraped with the bayonet from the hull of the APC he sent down Highway 1. He just keeps coming at me, holding out someone's soul for the U.S. mail. His face a map of all the roads we marched down, one boot after the other, into all the trophy cases of your goddamn VFW halls. You tell me how it ends. You got all the answers. I'm a big supporter of the Wounded Warrior Project. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize about a wounded soldier is that after the first couple of years of their return, unless they have real strong family support, they're soon forgotten, or at least pushed into the background. This poem is about a soldier like that I know. I'm really telling his story. It's called Missing in Action. The young corporal wants his arms back, and his girlfriend, and 2 hands to cut up Thanksgiving dinner before it gets cold. He wants to play again in the turkey bowl at his boyhood park with high school buddies like he used to, but they went missing into first homes with wives and kids playing in the backyard. He wants what else he lost on ambush patrol outside Tainan City, and to hell with the Bronze Star Medal and a disability check and a thank you for your service to this country. I lived in Colorado for a while up in the mountains, and I saw a lot of Vietnam veterans living out in the woods and hitchhiking along I-70. I had this thought about them. This was a poem that came to me every time I drove by them. It's called Mountain Men. I see them hobbling down foothills where I live now in retreat. What's left bulky on their backs, obscure as porcupines under folds of stocking hats and runaway beards. Buddies, brothers, uncles, fathers, cousins, circling to a lost LZ. I see them puzzled at highway exits like elk or bear when winter lasts too long. A species still wanting to live. Destinations scribbled on cardboard signs. Ears tied with bandanas. Hiding the sound of the torn air that split them through the middle. The sound no one can explain, that no one else will ever hear. Another thing about PTSD is that it's insidious, it's sneaky, it hides out, it's hardwired in the brain. And sometimes it's easy to avoid because soldiers come back and they get busy with life and they don't think about the war. They don't want to think about it. They just want to forget everything. It creeps up on them, and then one day, all of a sudden, there it is, and it comes down like a ton of bricks. I discovered this one day down in one of my basements. The poem is called Joy. The soldier who kills for fun can laugh at anything, but the man who is robbed of his laughter by the killing searches for it everywhere. Sometimes he encounters the shipping crate in his basement and says, "I should have thrown this away long ago," and pries open the lid. He sorts through the socks, underwear, camouflage boots, medallions, propaganda leaflets, and a pearl-handled Bowie knife inscribed with his name and 4th of the 9th Infantry, Manchu. "I should have thrown this away long ago," he says again, trying to feel how it was, the day after first grade, slamming the metal wheels of his skates to the sidewalk, the wind lifting him by the hair and laughing, laughing, laughing. But his voice only circles the barrel of his throat. His laughter mute as army green, coarse as a kettle drum. I avoid going to movies about the Vietnam War. Most of them are overdone or not realistic. One movie, though, that even though it wasn't realistic, made an impression on me because it conveyed to me the same gut feeling I had being in Vietnam and coming back from Vietnam, was the movie The Deer Hunter. It surprised me. It came out, I think, in 1978, and I had already written a poem that was in some ways similar to that movie. So it wasn't just a feeling that I had, I think it was a feeling that other people might have had. The poem is called Rabbit Hunting, and it comes in 2 acts. This is Act 1. Slugs from a .22 pump shattered the snow. The rabbit zigzagged grass clumps, frozen stiff above the surface, tumbled high in the air, recovered, bounded into the woods. They chased it 5 minutes or more before losing it in the twisted scrub oak, gullies, and piss elm. Uncle Joe was there, Little Joe, Robert, and him. The woods held the cold close to the ground, numbing his feet and his boots. He had not fired the shotgun that day. They cursed a wasted shot. He kept thinking of beef stew and hot chocolate, heat by the stove in the farmhouse. Then he saw it bobbing in the brush, circling away from their voices. It clawed forward, dragging its rump, leaving the snow red. He waited until it reached the ditch, not 5 feet away, watched it paw down the slope, flattened its head with a direct blast. Act 2. Home 2 weeks, he buttoned borrowed corduroy, walked in a line with his cousins and uncles, as they always had, heading north from the tractor shed. Not 20 yards out, a rabbit behind a combine wheel, a small gray rabbit, panicked, paddled adrift for a place in the trash pile. He squatted, sighted, military style, elbows on his knees, ready to fire, but stood up with a blood oath. I will not shoot another living thing. By God, I will not. In Vietnam, I met a lot of very young soldiers who had volunteered, who'd signed up for various reasons. A lot of them, though, were recruited by the Army and signed up in a moment of exhilaration, excitement, wanting to do something different. This poem is about one of them that I became fairly close to. It's called The Recruit. The girl of warm hands would never understand why he had forgotten the tic-tac of the rain on the shutters of the old house. She walked beside him on the first day home in the silence of an unseen rain. Said he only wanted to listen to the soft brush of the leaves overhead. Be 15 again. In 2000, I went back to Vietnam with my wife in a group, a nonprofit group that was providing loans to Vietnamese women. We visited the hooch of one of the women who had a flock of ducks. She was selling them to the market in Ho Chi Minh City. And that's where I spotted an old VC leaning against a tree. Much later, I remembered him when I was living in Colorado, sitting on a deck by myself. It's called Blood Brothers. An older GI stretches listlessly with a diluted glass of scotch on a chase long on a wooden deck above a meadow somewhere in the Rockies, held captive by the sight of wordless snowcaps where his hopes used to climb. Out of range, a once fiery VC with dagger-sharp white beard squats against a tree, inhaling deeply from a bong, head bowed to the grassless ground, outside his ancestral hooch by a rice paddy near Cu Chi, South Vietnam. Each vaguely recalls being a boy, one before the Vietnam War, the other before the American War, sucking now on a peace agreement, not of his own making. In 1969, neither knew history would write of two young enemies with much the same thoughts, bleeding to death so slowly, so painfully, from much the same wounds on opposite sides of the world. Or cast them as characters paused in the middle of a scene in a B movie by faceless men who suddenly pulled the plug and left. This last poem is called The Good Soldier. Many miles and many years from the Cambodian border, I wake these days at ground level, a better soldier who has tasted dust, crawled on ambush patrol ready to fire on any man or woman charging me with an urge to kill, no longer fearful, no longer vain. As for my son, my daughter, and the many wars to come, let me stand their watch so they too may have lovers. Cherish each smooth detail, eat and drink well, see the world in its many ways and peoples, walk forests, cross streams peacefully, lay on beaches to take the sun, hear the sweet shrieks of swirling gulls, swim waters of oceans and calm lakes. Let old men who make wars be those who fight them. Take me and leave my children. I am good at this gruesome business. I passed the course, and it comes easy now. Finally, at the end of every reading, I like to say this to the soldiers who never came home. I've told them all I know. You can rest now.